Hello and welcome to today's webinar on an introduction to managing risk. My name is Holly and I'm part of the professional development team here at FIIRSM. Your speaker today is Steve Fowler. Steve provides consultancy services specialising in international business strategy, risk and resilience, occupational health and safety and change management, and Steve is also a fellow of the Institute as well. So before we get started, there are just a couple of things to run through first. So to begin with, you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you'll be able to ask any questions you have using the chat function on the bottom right of the screen. Type your questions as they come to mind and we will pick these up at the end. And secondly, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be available on the FIIRSM YouTube channel after the event. Right, that's enough from me. Over to you, Steve.
Well, welcome to this half-hour webinar on managing risk for OSH professionals. It's a taster of what's included in FIIRSM's full-day managing risk course. We're going to cover hazard, risk and uncertainty, why manage risk, the importance of context and environment, how to identify, analyse and treat risk, and a simple framework for integrated risk management. Now we're going to start with uncertainty. We all live in a world that's fundamentally uncertain. Indeed, we live with those uncertainties every day, whether they be COVID-19, climate change, political change, terrorism, or cybercrime, or many others. Not all uncertainty, however, matters to every organisation. For instance, it might rain today, but would that affect your involvement in this webinar? Now, risk. Risk is what happens when uncertainty, which we've just talked about, and organisational objectives come together. In other words, it's uncertainty that matters. And you may have come across the term hazard as well. A hazard is a risk or a threat with a potential to cause injury and or ill health. So with so many terms in common usage, how do they all fit together? Well, maybe this diagram may help. What we can see here is that every risk is an uncertainty, but not every uncertainty is a risk. In other words, some uncertainties don't actually matter to organisations. They're just things that we live with. The other key point to take from the diagram is that risk, which is derived from the Italian word rischiare, meaning to dare, consists not just of threats and hazards, but also opportunities as well. Indeed, risk-taking can achieve positive as well as negative outcomes. So why manage risk? In the past, risk management was driven by regulation and by the need to protect life and limb. According to the International Labour Organization, 2.8 million people a year are killed by work-related accidents and disease. That's 1 every 17 seconds, or at least 2 since I started talking about this particular slide. This equates to about 4% of global GDP. Now these days, there are other reasons for managing risk as well. And I'm just going to touch on some of the bullet points on the slide here. Now many major projects fail in one way or another. I'm sure we can all think of examples, whether they be Crossrail, HS2, major construction projects or IT projects. Risk management can help achieve project success. Stakeholders too increasingly look for consistency in organisational performance, whether they be shareholders looking for a regular return on their investment, employees looking to their employer for a worthwhile or safe career, and customers deciding whether to buy from a particular brand. An organisation's reputation increasingly matters as well. And indeed, it's become one of the biggest factors in determining business value. In fact, up to 80% of the value of leading firms is derived from reputation, culture, and other so-called soft factors. This stuff really matters in hard business terms. So we've talked a bit about risk and why manage risk, but risk can be divided into many different classes. The key point to take from this particular slide is what's right for your organisation may not be right for another. So we've just given one example here, and it's a common method of dividing risks into strategic, financial, operational and hazard risk. As I just said, it's really important to keep in mind that this is a general way of dividing up risks. You may find that in your organisation you have another way of doing it. Now, we're probably all familiar with the last two categories, in other words, operational and hazard risks. These include areas such as workplace accidents, crime, IT failures, or failures of business processes. Increasingly, though, the first two categories, strategic and financial risks, are equally, if not more important. So let's just take the UK's decision to leave the EU. That's led to the pound dropping over 20% against the euro in 2 years. That's a fact. It's just the way it is. Now, that raises both opportunities, in other words, exports are cheaper, and threats, in other words, imports of raw materials are going to become more expensive. Therefore, the UK leaving the EU is a real financial risk for UK companies. But let's just bear in mind what we said earlier. A risk can be both a threat and opportunity, so it's worth keeping both sides of the coin in mind. But most of all, it's in the area of strategic risk where many organisations ultimately succeed or fail. In other words, the first strip on this slide. Technology change in particular, such as the advent of autonomous vehicles, raises both opportunities and threats for the motor industry, for instance. Now, so-called reputational risk isn't really a risk class on its own. It's the impact of other risks. Let's just think of one example here. Maybe you've had an accident at work. That can lead to an impact on the reputation of your organisation. Finally, a word on emerging risks. These are new risks that haven't been seen before, or existing ones that are evolving in unexpected ways. Now, whilst the world's always had the unexpected to deal with, in recent years, and particularly this year in 2020, they've become much more prominent. Indeed, the US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, talked about this way back in February 2002 in a talk to NATO in Brussels about the possibility of Iraq having so-called weapons of mass destruction. He said, there are known knowns, there are things that we know that we know. Well, I suppose that's obvious to all of us. There are known unknowns, that's to say there are things that we now know that we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we now know that we don't know. So what did he miss? Well, the one category he didn't cover were unknown knowns. And in 2020, we have a good example of that with us at the moment in COVID-19. COVID-19, or at least global pandemics, have been predicted to happen every year by the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And they've been considered to be a major threat to both the world, to countries, and to major businesses and populations around the world. However, it's probably fair to say that not many of us took that threat that seriously until this year. So what do we do about unknown knowns? One thing we can do about them is to network and read widely. If only we'd all read much more widely about the pandemic threat, maybe we would have seen it coming. The other thing is to know who as well as what to believe. Particularly in these days where so much is published on the web, it's really, really important to be able to differentiate between what's true and what's just opinion. Now, the good news is we have an international standard in ISO 31000-2018 that codifies good risk management practice. The standard is split into 3 parts: principles, process, and framework. And it's also a very good fit to ISO 45001, the health and safety standard, and ISO 9000, the quality management standard. Now, you'll see on this slide that there are a number of factors that make up the principles of managing risk. I'm not going to talk about all of them in this short webinar, but to just touch on a small number. Good risk management practice should always be proportionate. That's just down here on the left-hand side of the slide. What's right for a nuclear power plant isn't right for a small engineering firm. It should also be inclusive. It isn't a top-down or a bottom-up process, but should involve everyone throughout the organisation. And it should also use the best available information. Remember Donald Rumsfeld and the unknown knowns. Most of all, though, good risk management practice should be aligned to organisational objectives. Remember when defining risk earlier, we said that risk is what happens when uncertainty and organisational objectives comes together. Therefore, it's really important to align your approach to risk management to organisational objectives. It should be integrated throughout the organisation. Risk management should never be something done in a silo by one individual or small team of people. It should be everyone's business. And most of all, it should be focused around people. If you think about organisational successes or failures, quite often they're down to the people in that organisation. So that's a little bit about risk management principles. We're now going to move on to the second part of risk management, second part of ISO 31000, the risk management process, or what many people call doing risk management. Now you can see here that we've got two concentric circles. We've got an inner process supported by three other sets of processes. The important thing to take from the inner process is that it always starts with context and objectives. You always look at your context and objectives before moving on to risk assessment, or, in other words, identification, analysis, and evaluation. And only then do you then look at risk treatment, otherwise called risk response. Another key thing to gain from this particular diagram is that your approach to risk assessment and risk treatment should re-inform your organizational objectives and your context. So you may decide to change your business plan depending upon what you find when you go looking for risk and then dealing with it. Supporting this inner process, there are three other processes: recording and reporting risks, communicating and consulting on them, and monitoring and reviewing. Altogether, it makes up a continuous process linked to organizational strategy and values. Now, we said we start with context and objectives, and there are two parts to context: internal context and external context. Internal context includes areas such as the availability of capital and skills. It also includes, as I mentioned before, your business plan and objectives. Risk management should always start with these. Increasingly, though, it's a firm's culture that determines its future success. As the management guru Peter Drucker once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, external context includes those things which are changing in the outside world, whether they be political, economic, social, technological, legal, or environmental in nature. So that's a little bit on context and objectives. And we're now going to move on to the second part of the risk management process. In other words, risk assessment. This is what many people think of as the core of risk management. And it consists of two components. Firstly, risk identification, and then risk analysis and evaluation. Now, you will come across lots and lots of different ways of identifying, analysing, and evaluating risk. In fact, there's a subsidiary standard to ISO 31000 called ISO 31010, and that sets out some 50 to 60 different techniques for risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. Right here, right now, we're just going to touch on 4 of them. When it comes to risk identification, the simplest techniques are often the best, and therefore it's no surprise that I've listed interviews, surveys, and workshops as the primary technique to use when looking for risk. It's also good, though, particularly at a time when so much is changing in so many unexpected ways, to look at scenario analysis, to look at alternative outcomes, depending upon what might happen in the outside world. Now, when we move on to analysis and evaluation, I'm just going to touch on two methods, but we will allude to the fact that there are lots of others, and you'll probably find many of the others in use in your own organization. The bow tie technique is a diagrammatic way of describing and analyzing the pathways of a risk from its various causes right through to an event happening, through to the various consequences that may arise from that event. In fact, it's a combination of two other techniques: fault tree, which looks at causes, and event tree, which looks at consequences. Now, those of you who work in financial services will probably have come across value at risk before. This is a financial technique widely used in banks that uses an assumed probability distribution of losses to calculate the value of an individual loss. The key thing about value at risk is that it assumes a specified probability during a defined time span. In other words, very steady state conditions. When you're looking at these techniques, always bear in mind that as well as the upside to each technique, there are downsides to every technique that you might use. And that in particular, valid and reliable data in sufficient quantity, form, and frequency is absolutely essential. You can't make conclusions from a very small quantity of data, and you should always consider the limitations of and the interpretation of data. So having identified and analysed your risks, it's important to keep a record. And the most normal way of doing this is through using what's called a risk register, listed first here on the list on this slide. The information contained in a risk register can be communicated in many ways, and we're just going to touch on one in this short webinar: heat maps, otherwise called risk matrices, but bear in mind that other methods are available. And most of all, don't underestimate the importance of informal or face-to-face risk reporting. These are often the best way to get over true information about risk to hard-pressed business executives. So we've got an example here. It's quite a busy slide, an example of a risk register. And you'll see in the first column, and apologies if you can't actually read the words, the actual words don't matter. It's just an example of a risk here. So it's been described here. And in the second column, we've given an indication of its potential impact and its potential likelihood on the business. So for this particular risk, we've said the impact is medium and the likelihood is medium. We've then listed a risk owner. My own personal view is that the risk owner should always be an individual, for instance, Steve Fowler, rather than personnel committee. We all know what happens when something's allocated to a committee. It might not get done. In the fourth column, we're listing here the controls that the organisation's decided to put in place to deal with the risk here. And then the second half of the risk register, you see the first half is headed gross risk. Second half, which is headed net risk, looks again at the impact and likelihood of the risk after the application of these controls. So we can see that the impact has stayed medium there, and then after the controls it's medium, but the likelihood is reduced from medium down to low. So this shows that the controls are having some impact on that risk. The rest of the risk register deals with further actions that might be taken to deal with the risk. Now, keep in mind that last risk. Remember that we said initially it was medium impact and medium likelihood. A heat map shows what a risk looks like in terms of its potential impact on the organization compared with other risks. So remember we said the impact of the last risk was medium, in other words, on a 1 to 5 scale, 3, and the likelihood was medium, in other words, 3. So that places it round about here in the orange zone on this heat map. So you might find that other risks listed on your risk register One might be down here in the green area here, a low impact, low likelihood risk, and another one, which is potentially high impact, high likelihood risk, might be up here. So in other words, you've got a visual indication as to which risks are most likely to happen and most likely to impact your organization. It's just a much easier way of looking at risks in comparison with each other than ploughing through a risk register. So we've looked at context and environment. We've also looked at risk assessment. What more is there to do? Well, unless we actually take some action, there's no point in doing anything before that. Now, let me introduce you to the 4 T's: tolerate, treat, terminate, and transfer. And this is just shorthand for different ways that we might deal with a risk. For a minor risk, we might tolerate the risk, we might accept it, we might take no action but continue to monitor it. I guess we can all think of examples of things that are potentially risks in our lives, our personal lives or our working lives, where we've decided we'll just take the risk. There's no point in doing anything about it. We'll live with the consequences. For anything more substantial, we might decide to actually treat the risk. In other words, we'll put in place a physical process or human or cultural change. So a physical change could be something like installing a sprinkler system or putting a guard on a machine. A process change might involve changing a process completely to eliminate a risky part of that process. Or a human change might involve retraining someone to carry out a process in a different way. Terminating. For very major risks where no significant risk treatment is available, we might just decide to stop doing the thing that might lead to the risk. For instance, you're a company exporting to a country where war has just broken out. There's not much you can do to reduce the risk. So what you decide to do is to stop exporting to that country. You terminate the risk. And finally, risk transference. I always think that this is a bit of a misnomer and personally prefer to call it risk sharing. So people talk about risk transfer, insurance as a form of risk transfer, or outsourcing or using contract terms. But if you just think about those for a few moments, they can all go wrong. Insurance companies can go out of business, leaving you with a risk. And equally, what you thought was a valid insurance claim, the insurer might feel isn't a valid insurance claim. Equally, the world's full of outsourcing arrangements that didn't quite work out, or contract terms that are interpreted by the other side's lawyer in a different way to the way your lawyer interpreted it. Always remember that you remain accountable for the risk, even if you transfer it. And this brings us back to reputation. You know, you could do anything you like to try and transfer risks to someone else, but if it's your name on the product or the service, your customers will feel you're responsible for what happened. And you might put any of these in place, but don't forget there might still be residual risk. That's one reason why the risk management process is a circular process, why you should always go round the loop again. So having eliminated some risk, you might then decide to put further treatments in place to deal with it. Now, remember earlier I said that there were 3 parts to ISO 31000. We talked quickly about principles. We've now spent a fair bit of time talking about process, and I'm now going to move on to risk management frameworks. In other words, the organization for managing risk within your own organization. Leadership for this must come from the top of the organization. And a typical framework follows the plan, do, check, act cycle, familiar to those who've used the quality, environmental, health and safety management system standards. But in this case, they're known as design, implement, evaluate, and improve. But I hope, like me, you feel that design is really plan, implement is really do, evaluate is really check, and improve is really act. So it's the same thing as you might do in a quality management cycle or a safety management cycle. Where does all this lead? Well, putting in place a framework usually leads to production of a hard physical risk management policy. What this does is it sets out the rationale for managing risk in your organization, usually in plain language, and linked to organizational vision and values. Documents like this are only of any value if they can be understood by everyone who reads them. It should set out legal and regulatory requirements for your organization when it comes to managing risk, who's accountable for risk, and who's got responsibility for which parts of the risk management process, and what resources are available to support them. This should cover the terminology that you use in your organization. Remember, I said earlier that when we were talking about risk treatment, some people call that risk response. What do you call it in your organization? It should set out the process that you're using, the tools that you're using, and the timetable. A word on risk appetite. This is the board's view of what level of risk the organization's willing to take. And it's really important that no matter who puts the risk appetite statement together, it should be agreed at board level, and it should fit with your business plan. And then finally, it should set out the usual areas that are covered in policies. In other words, conflicts of interest, measurement and reporting, ownership of the policy, and the review process. Now, we're coming to the end now. I said at the beginning that we would look at hazard, risk, and uncertainty and how they fit together. We then said we'd look at why we manage risk, what's the rationale behind it. We then spent a bit of time looking at the importance of context and environment, both internal and external. And then I took you through a simple risk management process cycle. In other words, how we identify, analyze, and then treat risk. And finally, we've just looked at a simple framework for integrated business risk. Now, that's almost the half hour up. I think we've got a bit of time for some questions. So if you want to start thinking about your questions and using the chat facility, which should appear on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, we'll try and deal with that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So as mentioned at the start of the webinar, if you haven't got any questions, please feel free to ask those in the chat function, and we will take 5 to 10 minutes to deal with those now. So, but to begin with, Steve, I've got a question for you, which is how can risk management help us recover from the coronavirus pandemic?
Thanks, Holly. What a good question to start on. If only we had the answers to this, we'd all be in a much healthier place than we are at the moment. Well, the good news is that risk management can help. By taking a systematic approach, we can help to do two things. One is to help us recover from the current crisis, and the second thing is to help us to rebuild from that crisis. Taking the first one of those, recovery, the good thing about risk management is that it applies a systematic process to dealing with complex questions like these. So some of the sorts of things that maybe you should be thinking about as an organization are looking at your business continuity planning. To what extent did your current business continuity plans deal well with the pandemic when it hit us? And to what extent could they be improved? What worked, what didn't work? Some of the other areas in terms of recovery are looking at things like communication, both with your own team, your own people, but also with customers and suppliers. Indeed, people forms a very large part of this. We are all human beings, and it's very easy as an organization, as a business, when talking about people, to think of the hard side of people management. In other words, occupational safety and health, travel instructions, PPE, working protocols. But also, we should be taking a moment to think about our people as human beings. Maybe people have lost loved ones. Maybe people are on their own at home and haven't spoken to anyone else for weeks on end. This will have an impact on the way that they work. We should think about our customers. The one thing that the pandemic has done is to expose supply chain weaknesses. technology, insurance. There's a long, long list. Longer term, just briefly, some of the key questions we should be asking using risk management are: where are we now as an organization, and what do we need to do to survive? What are the most important changes we need to face, and what options have we got? Now, if you're a IIRSM member, there's going to be an article covering a lot of this in a lot more depth in the next edition of the Sentinel magazine. So I'd look out for that. So I hope that's just a brief introduction to some of the ways that risk management can help. I see we've got some questions coming through the chat channel here. Go ahead, Holly.
And so the first one is, how can we assess moral hazards during the risk inspections?
Mohammed, if only we had the answer to that. It's a difficult thing to do. I don't have an easy answer to that. As it depends upon your culture, where you're operating. Indeed, if you're operating in an environment where you've got people from different cultures, the moral hazards can be different depending upon who we're looking at. So taking a very open-minded approach to looking at moral hazard does help. There isn't an easy answer, is the answer to that question. Sorry. Second question coming through from Abdul Latif. Are opportunities included in the risk register? Yes, very much so, Abdul Latif. In this short 25-minute webinar, we didn't have the opportunity to show that in the example of the risk matrix that we put up. I think I was about 2/3 of the way through. If you remember the graph where we plotted risks by impact and likelihood, you can also plot opportunity risks as well as threats in the same way using a heat map. Yes, but very much you should include opportunities in the risk register. The one thing I'd suggest is, if you're interested in pursuing this in more detail, the full one-day IIRSM course on managing risk does cover this subject in quite a lot more detail. Next question from Rasib Hussain. Is the ISO standard for this available, and why was the pandemic not identified by risk professionals? Well, ISO 31000, the risk management standard, if that's the one you're looking at, that is available. Like all ISO standards, though, they actually charge from it. So you have to buy it from your own national standards body. The one thing that isn't commonly known is that ISO and its constituent bodies, so ANSI in the USA, BSI in the UK, DIN in Germany, and so on and so forth, are commercial organizations. The good news, though, is that there are on the internet a lot of simple summaries of the ISO standard that cover much the same ground as the standard, and you don't pay for them. As for the pandemic, I mean, the somewhat worrying thing is, yes, it was identified. It's been heavily identified every year for 10 years as a potential risk. Now, the problem with pandemics is that they fall into the category of what are called low probability, high impact risks. So the sort of risks that, if they happen, they're going to have a tremendous impact on operations, as we've seen with COVID-19 this year. But, they're very unlikely to happen. So the tendency is for organizations or governments to ignore them. Now, the World Economic Forum, which consists of about 1,000, 2,000 individuals meeting in Davos in Switzerland every year, they put together a risk report for the world, if you like, the world's risk register every year. And this is published, it's on the internet. It's called Global Risk Report. Anyone can download it, and it's free. And it does talk in a lot of detail about the major risks to the world. And one of the top 10, indeed, for the last few years, top 3 major risks to the world has been the risk of pandemic. It's one thing to identify risk, but it's another thing to do something about it. And the shame is that most countries in the world decided not to do anything about it until the pandemic hit. We've got some more coming through here. Zohair, you're saying to transfer the risk, would it be ethical? I assume you're talking about risks generally. If we're looking at a risk generally, the reality is that some parts of a risk can never be transferred. So ownership of the impact of the risk always remains with an organization. So let's think of an example. In the UK, there was a major accident where people were badly hurt at the Alton Towers theme park in the middle of England a couple of years ago. Now, whilst the risk was insured, the reputational impact of that happening remained with the company operating the theme park. You can never transfer the reputational impact of a risk. It remains with you forevermore, and so it should do. This is one reason why, if we had more time, and again, this webinar isn't really an advert for the full one-day course, but on the full one-day course, we do talk about risk transference and how risk transference really is risk sharing. It's a way of involving others in taking some parts of a risk, but not the whole of the risk. Catherine, are psychosocial risks also assessed? Yes, very much so. I mean, the one thing I'd urge everyone to do when looking at risk is not to focus purely on hard, if you like, engineering risks. When I look at an organization, when any of us looks at an organization that's either failed or succeeded, it's very easy to conclude that failure or success often comes down to people, almost invariably comes down to people, and comes down to the psychosocial risks that are associated with those people. I mean, they can be negative in terms of what can go wrong, but they can also be positive in terms of creating the right working environment, leading to the development and marketing of the right products and services. So I think,
Steve, so that's all of the time that we've got for questions today. Before we finish, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, as Steve mentioned, we run a training course, which is also delivered by Steve, covering the essentials of risk management. It's usually delivered face-to-face over one day, but we are moving this online, and we'll be able to share more details about that shortly. And secondly, we're also developing a qualification, the Certificate in Managing Risk, in conjunction with NEBOSH for those looking for more in-depth study on the topic, and this is due to pilot in the autumn. So if you'd like further information about either of those initiatives, please email training@iirsm.org and we'll get back to you with more detail. So thank you, Steve, and thank you.
Thanks, Holly,
for joining today. That's all we have time for, so enjoy the rest of your days and goodbye.